This is the Lew Rockwell Show.
Our guest today is Dr. Guido Hülsmann. Guido is chairman of the economics department at the University of Angers in France. He's a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He's the author of 5 books, many important papers. His most recent book is the magisterial biography of Mises, Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism. His forthcoming book is all too appropriate and timely. It's called The Ethics of Money Production. And Guido, I want to talk to you today about the crisis, of course, your view of it from Europe, and maybe how you think Europe may get caught up in this as well.
Lou, it's good to be with you today. I had a good laugh 2 days ago when the president of France, Sarkozy, gave the speech in New York, and he was waving his fingers at the Wall Street elites around him and saying that now politicians like himself would go after the responsibles. This was very funny because Sarkozy, during his presidential election campaign in early 2007, had himself called for more laxity in according credits to subprime customers, which was not yet developed in France as it was in the U.S. So in a way, I mean, he definitely counts among the responsibles. I wonder whether he will hold on to his own nose as a first step in persecution of the responsibles.
You know, I'm always interested. We hear a lot of talk here about predatory lending, quote unquote, and yet you actually had the U.S. government through the Community Reinvestment Act and through the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and all sorts of regulatory measures ordering banks to give these loans with no down payment, no checking of assets or income to people who were from poor neighborhoods, that this was necessary for social justice. So it wasn't, the banks could get in very big trouble if they didn't make these loans. So exactly. I don't want to exempt the banks.
I mean, it's a rather blatant attempt to steal themselves out of their own responsibility. I mean, all these things are recorded in detail. So, I mean, you just need to look this up through Google or something. You'll find any of 5 to 10 papers detailing how these government interventions created precisely the problem that we now confront in the subprime sector. But in a way, as we Austrian economists have always pointed out, this is only accidental. I mean, it's not really the crucial thing is not the subprime market. This was just the way where the sector of the financial markets where this present crisis broke out. But the fundamental point is that due to our monetary systems, the financial markets as a whole, not only in the U.S. but on a worldwide scale, have become increasingly fragile. They are fragile because the presence of central banking encourages debt-based investment strategies. It's better for the individual investor to go short when investing, take a credit, and then speculate when buying an asset that the prices in the medium and long run will always increase because the Fed always pumps more money into the market. Now, but when one individual investor does this, that's of course not a big systematic problem, but when everybody does this, then the failure of any one of them creates something like a snowball effect, in the course of which everybody else gets into trouble and also falters. So in a way, the question where the crisis broke out, whether it was the subprime market or some other market, is completely secondary. The main thing is the fragility of the financial markets, which has resulted from the presence of our monetary system. And it could have been any other sector where difficulties first appeared, and we would have a very similar problem as we have today.
Guido, the last time we talked before this present crisis, you said that from your standpoint that it looked like they were going to risk hyperinflation rather than allow prices to go down. And it seems like you were exactly right.
Yeah, I think, well, in this case, I always say to my audiences, not only students, but, I mean, talks that I give at the Mises Institute and elsewhere, that I'm only an economist. I'm not somebody who has a glass ball and can predict the future. But this was a pretty easy one. The basic rationale is as follows. Bailing out a market, bailing out the entire financial market, of course, involves a cost, which is paid by the population as a whole, because the bailout involves always an increase of the money supply, and so the purchasing power per unit of money is decreased. That's how the common man pays for the subsidy given to Wall Street. whereas the other solution would be to allow Wall Street to falter. And in this case, then of course it would be the elites, or economic and political elites, who would be first in line to pay the price for the past mistakes. Now, it's not rocket science to predict that if people who are themselves part of the elites and making a political decision that concerns the elites, well, then they will have themselves and their friends, especially close to their heart, and make a decision accordingly. So that's what's being presently done. I understand that yesterday evening, or yesterday in the course of the day, there was an announcement made by several Republicans and Democrats that they had reached an agreement on the $700 billion bailout plan, which was, as I also understand, running against the expressed interest of the American people. So by a 10-to-1 margin or something like this, Americans were against this. Now, how can they afford to do this? I think it's clearly that the matter is of so overriding importance to themselves that they even risk a revolution, they even risk a popular uprising, rather than risk an immediate evaporation of the privileged position in which they themselves and their friends are. So that's just basic economics, self-interest. These people are at any time opting for an expansionary and inflationary solution in order to keep themselves in power.
You know, it's interesting, Guido, that the neoconservatives and other advocates of big government typically target the House of Representatives as the worst branch of government. And it's because the House of Representatives, I'm speaking within the state paradigm here, is the branch of government that's the most amenable to popular pressure. The people can have no effect on the Supreme Court, no effect on the presidency, very little effect on the Senate, but congressmen who have to, and in fact, of course, the entire House of Representatives is up for election in November, they can be affected by the fact that they're hearing 200-to-1 from their constituents. They're just inundated by phone calls and by emails, and everybody is intense and angry. So I imagine that they'll get this through eventually by bribery, bludgeoning, and all the normal tactics. But it is interesting that the one thing that's giving them trouble is the House.
It's true. I mean, in this case, there is a fortunate coincidence that this problem arises so shortly ahead of the elections. So, I mean, if we can look at the past as a reliable guide for the future, I should say that probably they will make election promises to their constituency that they will never vote for something like this to happen, and then once they're in office, something of the sort will still be negotiated. I mean, that's happened in 1994 when we had the Republican Revolution in Congress, and all these new office holders were swept into the Congress, and then finally were very quickly brought to reason by the establishment.
It's true. You can't count on the government. I mean, that's absolutely true.
No, unfortunately, and I mean, as you yourself have pointed out in many articles and many other writers also on LewRockwell.com, it's politics itself that corrupts people. Even if they start off with good intentions, they cannot stay very long in the game if they do not comply to play the good old boys game.
I hear from some of the observers in Europe that there are concerns about a euro crisis, that not only a dollar crisis, but a euro crisis. What do you think? Yeah. Is that correct, and what are the effects of that going to be?
Well, I think that's the correct speculation about the future. I share this view too. The basic error that you find in many analyses, also especially of financial economists, monetary economists in the U.S., but also in Europe, is that they seem to think that the financial markets and the monetary economy in general is somehow disconnected from the rest of the economy, and in particular from production. Now, that's not the case. The problem that we have right now is that we have a complete rearrangement of revenues within the economy. Before the crisis brought us, we had an unsustainable situation because some revenues were, kind of imaginary revenues maintained by cheap credit coming from the Federal Reserve. Now this illusion has fallen away. It is clear that these revenues do not exist, and therefore it is also clear that the money that these people who had these revenues, homeowners and others, and which they spent before, can no longer be spent. And necessarily this must have repercussions on corporate revenues. And because we live in an age of globalization and companies are intertwined, is an international division of labor, necessarily the collapse of some industrial firms within the U.S. Will very quickly have repercussions on the trading partners of the U.S. in Europe, Japan, and China in particular. So I should not be surprised if the next crisis flames up either in China or in Europe.
You've mentioned before that this might lead to calls for a global central bank and global government of the sort that John Maynard Keynes was advocating in the 1930s during the last Great Depression.
Yeah. For the moment, the Europeans are very reluctant to take part in the bailout plan that is being discussed in Washington. There was a very cold reaction in Germany in particular. The French were a little bit more open to this whole idea. But there was then a declaration coming from the European Commission saying that these kind of issues should be addressed within each nation. And I think that's not something that that's not a position that will hold up if the crisis really sweeps over to Europe. I think they will have second thoughts. And then the idea that such issues can only be addressed from a global point of view will get new prominence. Right? I mean, as long as the rationale is quite straightforward, if you have a financial crisis of the present dimension, then you cannot prevent that it sweeps over to other countries, and so it's better to have a concerted policy reaction to this, sweep the markets in all countries with a lot of money and public subsidies and so on. Because if you don't do this, then the crisis might continue and develop in one sector of the world and then hop back to the other places where the government calmed it down in the first place. So I think we'll have this debate in the coming months. Europeans will have second thoughts on this, and then, of course, according to the logic of the whole argument, there will be proposals to establish some kind of a world financial regulation, or maybe even a world central bank to provide global markets with liquidity.
We know from the Austrian economists that the errors take place during the boom, and that the bust is when the correction can take place. And yet, in the U.S., Bernanke and Paulson and Bush and all the rest of them seem to be following the Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt playbook that'll end up extending and deepening this recession potentially into another Great Depression. And, of course, the argument is you can't just do nothing. You must do all these things because otherwise the sky falls and the world comes to an end. What would happen if, in the extremely unlikely event that they did the right thing in Washington and did nothing? What would be the results?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that this will entail a snowball effect that will lead to the collapse of large parts, if not all, of the financial markets, and of course will also create financial hardships for people who live off money invested in the financial markets, people who have no other source of revenue. Well, this is obvious. But in a way, of course, the great advantage of this solution is that when it comes to an end, and if history is any guide, we know that it will come to an end rather quickly if the market is allowed to operate within 1 and 3 years. If it comes to an end, well, we really have reached rock bottom, and we can build things up from there. And another great charming aspect of such a solution is that you get rid, by and large, of those people who are responsible for the present mess. You get rid of the bankers, you get rid of monetary policy experts who have proven their incapacity in the past, you get rid of the financial markets who have lived off the Federal Reserve, and you give new impetus to the industrial sector and other parts of the economy where you can earn revenues without cooperating with a central bank.
Dr. Guido Hülsmann, thanks so much in the middle of this crisis for coming and telling us the truth.
It's a great pleasure, Lew.
You've been listening to The Lew Rockwell Show, produced by LewRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertise@LewRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.